Well, Cuba is trying to ease concerns about the arrival of Russian warships in Havana next week. The ships will be there to carry out naval exercises along with Moscow's allies, Cuba and Venezuela. Cuban officials have said the Russian ships will not have any nuclear weapons on board and that they did not present a threat to the region. U.S. officials have said they don't see the arrival of Russian ships to Cuba as threatening, but that the U.S. Navy would be monitoring the exercises. For more, let's cross to our correspondent in Havana, Ed Augustin. Ed, what are Cuban officials saying exactly about what to expect when these exercises take place next week?
Well, as you said in your introduction, they've been downplaying it discursively. They've been saying, that the submarine is not going to be armed with a nuclear missile. It'd be very odd if it were, given how close Cuba is to the United States and the backlash that would create. But but beyond predictable words from the Cuban Foreign Ministry, I think the backdrop of this is Cuba's huge economic crisis and its increasing inability to keep the lights on. I'm speaking to you from Havana, where we're privileged. We've only had 4 hours of power cuts today. In lots of the provinces that make up most of the country, people are sometimes going without like 20 hours per day. And so what we're seeing is Cuba trying to court Russia because they need the oil, they need the petrol. And within that context, there's actually been quite a bit of fanfare around this within Cuba. So I got a press release this morning from the Cuban the Cuban Revolutionary Armed Forces, and they announced that they're going to be, the day that the 3 warships and the 1 submarine come into Havana Bay, there's going to be a 21-gun salute. So it's all quite showy. They're going to be putting on a bit of razzle-dazzle. And I think what Cuban politicians are trying to communicate to their populace is that Cuba's not completely alone at this time, that the regime has international allies. And I think what they're trying to telegraph and communicate to the United States implicitly is that if they get hit even harder with the sanctions have been ratcheted up to unprecedented heights since the Trump administration. The Biden administration's kept most of them in place, that they'll get closer to Russia. And that is not something that US policymakers, particularly in the Democratic Party, but many within the Republican Party, want. And so Cuba wants to ratchet up and telegraph its nuisance value that it's historically been very good at doing, at a time when, frankly, Cuba's way down the headlines and way down most policymakers' thoughts in the United States. They want to get back up there so that they can get some sanctions relief.
Of course, this comes in the context of strained relations, to put it mildly, between the U.S. and Russia over Ukraine. But how does the Cuban public view the presence of Russian military power on its shores?
Mixed, as you can imagine, in an island of 10 or 11 million people. I mean, it's worth saying that the way in which Russia's invasion of Ukraine is covered and talked about in many European nations is very different to how it is here. First of all, geographically, Cuba's just a very long way away from that, and people feel far away from it. Second of all, the economic crisis is so stultifying, stultifying is not the right word. People are up to their eyeballs with difficulties of putting food on the plate, power cuts, how am I going to be able to get to work, that in a sense, thinking about international issues such as Russia, Ukraine, seems a little bit abstract. And of course, you do have a lot of nostalgic value for the former Soviet Union. People remember that when the quote-unquote Russians were closer to Cuba, for good or for ill, people had a better quality of life. So particularly amongst the older generations, there's a nostalgic value and fond memories. Lots of people traveled there, studied there. But overall, it's not seen in the dangerous light that it is certainly by NATO countries. And I think a lot of people think practically, if they're going to bring us food, if they're going to give us cheap petrol, if the Europeans don't want to buy it, so much the better.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Our correspondent in Havana, Ed Augustin. Ed, thanks so much. We appreciate it. Well, here in